Hi, this is David Farkas with Red Dot Forum. Today, we're going to talk about Lightroom presets, what they are, why you wouldn't use them, and how to incorporate them into your own workflow. So stick around. All right, so I've set up a new catalog here in Lightroom so we can bring photos in. I don't have any presets, I don't have any pictures in here already. We're just gonna bring photos in directly out of camera and see how we can create a preset and then apply it to the next batch of photos. And you'll see how it's a little different. So I've got some images here. Last fall, I led a workshop to Maine. We did the Maine coast. So this is some of the photos I took with the Leica S Type 007. They're pretty big files. These are medium format Leica DNGs, so they are gonna be pretty sizable. And the previews you see here, this is just out of camera. There is no adjustments made to these whatsoever. So what I'll do, I don't wanna import all of them, just for the sake of demonstration. Let's go ahead and just import a subset of these. So what I'll do is I'll just uncheck all. I've highlighted a few here and I'm going to check the box. And now I've got 16 photos. So just to speed things along for your viewing, I'll set these to one-to-one previews. I'll build smart previews. And you'll see here, develop settings right now is set to none. So we're not applying any preset on these photos. And I'm just gonna bring them into this main October 2017 workshop folder on an external Samsung SSD. So let me import these and then we'll pick up once they complete. Okay, so my import is completed. The computer has gone ahead and built previews for these. So I actually have smart previews, plus I have one-to-one previews just to speed things along in terms of the editing. It does take a little longer. And I don't usually recommend that for in the field editing, but if you have time and you have a fast computer at home, you should try it out. All right, so overall they look pretty good. I'm gonna go into the develop module here, and you can do this either by clicking the develop module icon right here, or you can just hit the D key, which is usually what I do, because I actually like to hide this bar. And if I just hit D to go into develop, I have all that extra space, which you can see here, for the picture. So the pictures actually shows up bigger, which I like. And it doesn't look bad. Right out of the box, no adjustments. You can see here, going down the adjustment panels. In my basic tab here, I've got all 0 sliders. We can see that there's no tone curve applied, no color, no split toning, default sharpening, default noise reduction, and default lens profiles. So everything is pretty much out of camera. There is no adjustments done to this besides just Lightroom defaults. So what I'm gonna do though is I like to apply a preset for this camera on import and every camera. And I'm gonna dial in some quick settings that I happen to know work well for this camera. And you can just quickly follow along here. So what I like to do is bring my highlights down, which brings in more highlight detail. Similarly, I like to bring up my shadows, which gives me more shadow detail. But that results in a very flat looking image. So to counteract that and to add a little bit more life back, I'll bring up my whites and I bring down my blacks. So what that gives me is basically contrast to the image while still having detail in the highlights and shadows. And because it darkens the image slightly, I am gonna also boost the exposure just a hair. And moving on from there, I don't usually touch the contrast slider. I like to adjust using whites and blacks. Moving on, I do put in a little bit of clarity, just a smidge. I don't touch dehaze. Dehaze is a very dangerous tool. It used to be hidden down at the bottom. They've now put it up in this presence tab area, and I'm not a fan, so we're gonna skip over that. I am gonna dial in a little bit of vibrance and a little bit of saturation. Now a lot of this is just to taste, but you can see here, it works pretty well in this image. I'm gonna leave everything else alone. I don't usually use the tone curve, even though I do use curves in Photoshop. I don't usually use it much in Lightroom. And the sharpening. So here, I'm gonna set the sharpening to my default, which is 70, 0.8, 40, and 10. A lot of people ask me, do you sharpen per image, and how do you know that you've applied enough sharpening? I actually sharpen for the sensor in a particular model camera, because either you've taken a sharp picture or you haven't. You've used a good lens that's crisp and sharp, or you haven't. I'm a little bit spoiled using Leica cameras that pretty much all the lenses I use and all the sensors I use are ridiculously sharp, and they don't have anti-aliasing filters over the sensors, so all I really need to do is a very small amount of sharpening with a very small radius, and gives me just that extra little bit of kick that I like. So I don't like to over sharpen, I just like to perfectly sharpen. And I do this exact sharpening for every single image out of this camera, regardless of the image taken, of the subject matter, of the output size. Doesn't matter to me. Noise reduction, I'm just gonna set at 10, which I find to be a good default. And we're gonna go further down the list. So here, this actually works, but I will set it to auto. Here it is correctly identifying my lens, although you can see it does very, very little. That's with no profile correction, and that's with profile correction. The lenses for the S system have such low distortion characteristics that this helps, but it's not super necessary. For a lot of other cameras, like the Leica SL, you'll actually see down here in this area a little eye icon and in gray, and it'll say built-in lens profile applied rather than the selectable lens profiles. And that's fine. That just means that the profile's being applied to the raw file in the camera before it even gets here. Here, the raw file doesn't have the lens correction, it just has the data for the lens that's used. We're gonna leave all this alone, and I just wanna make sure that the process version is the latest, version 4. And that's basically it. This is everything that I'd like to do to this file, and I think it looks pretty good as is. If we wanna see how that applies to another image, I can click on another image and just say previous. And it works pretty well here. I'd say it's a little cool. So just adding a little bit of warmth to the white balance, and we're there. And that's basically what a preset is, except I haven't created one yet. I've just applied those same settings to another photo. But I have to actually click on that photo, because if I go to another photo and then another one after that and click previous, nothing will happen. All the sliders are still at 0. So let's say that I don't do the previous, but I'm gonna go through and do the exact same edits, or roughly the same edits, to every single file going through here. This is pretty crazy, and I do see a lot of people kind of with this behavior where they're going through and correcting each and every single image. So this is a little nuts to go through and set all your sharpening settings all the same. You know, even if you're keying it in, I'm using the mouse here, but imagine if I had to go through and set the same settings for every single one. This would take me forever. And it's just not a good look. So let's go back to this image. Now I can jump over and I can say previous, and that looks a whole lot nicer. I can also use the copy, which is gonna copy settings. And once I click that, I can go to another file and say paste. So there's two different ways to do that. You can either use the previous, or you can use the copy paste method. Or we can do what I'm suggesting, which is to create a preset. So going back to our original image that I dialed these in on, we're going to go up to the Presets tab on the left-hand side of the Develop module. And up here, you can see that there's actually some built-in profiles, or presets rather, filed under Color, Creative, Black and White. So Lightroom actually has some built in, and we'll talk about that in the next section. But for right now, we're gonna create our preset. So just go to Add New Preset and Create Preset. So for me, this is a Leica S007, and you can personalize it. I could say David's Leica S007 preset, if it helps you out. You can call this whatever you'd like. So I'm just gonna call it David's Leica S007 preset for argument's sake here, for just demonstration. You can select which items that you want to save. So for instance, let's say I don't want to affect the white balance ever, I can uncheck that. But I want my lens corrections in there, I want my calibration, my basic tone adjustments, and my clarity, dehaze, sharpening, color, all this. You can keep all that here. So we're gonna create that under, by default, user presets, although you can actually create a new group and call it whatever you like. So if you have David's cameras, you could create a group and put all your cameras into that preset. So I'll create it, and you see over here on the left-hand side, user presets and David's Leica S007 preset. Let me just jump to an image that I haven't touched yet, like this water image. And what's pretty cool is I just hover over this and it changes, or at least previews it live. Used to be that you'd have to use the navigator up here and it would preview in this little box, but we can keep that navigator box closed. It now, in the latest version of Lightroom, will actually show you that on the whole image. And when I click it, it applies those settings. And that looks pretty good. Moving on, again, I can just select that preset, and it works really well for most of these images. So when you look at an image like this out of camera, I quickly apply that preset, and it looks a whole lot nicer. So the colors have more richness to them, the image has more depth, it has more apparent detail in the highlights and shadows, while at the same time having more contrast, which is really my secret to image processing. And I can darken that up. Let's say I can bring my shadows down if I want. I can bring those blacks down. So any change that you make, you can update your preset. Let's say that I like this setting rather than the one I had. If you just merely right click on the preset, you can update with current settings, and that'll overwrite the original preset with these new settings. But I'm gonna leave the original settings alone. And what we're gonna do now is import the next batch of photos. And on this one, I'm gonna do it a little differently. Let me go back to Library, which is G on the keyboard. Okay, G, just think G for grid of pictures, D for develop. And we're gonna go back to our import dialog. I'll go back to my memory card here. And it already knows that I've imported these 16 photos, so I've got 69 more pictures here following. And what we're gonna do is, this time around, apply during import, I'm gonna say develop setting, user preset, David's Leica S007 preset that we just created. So it's important to note, once you create this, whether you create it, you modify it, or if you import it, because you got a preset from somewhere else, you do not have to restart Lightroom. You don't have to go to any preferences window. It just shows up. So we've got that preset dialed in, and I'm gonna go ahead and import these. In this case, I'm actually gonna just do standard so I don't sit here for 3 hours. And we're gonna import these, and we'll restart the video as soon as the import is done. Okay, so my import is completed, my previews are generated. And you might notice these look a little different because they're not strictly out of camera, in air quotes. Okay, these all have the preset applied that we just created from the last import. And why do I like that? Well, it allows me to actually see the pictures as I visualize the camera should look. And they're gonna require a lot less work per image. So let's say I see one of these, I'm gonna go back into develop, and that looks a little bright to me. Well, it's easy to fix, because all I have to do is dial back my brightness, but all my other settings, everything from my sharpening to my presence settings, everything is already dialed in, and all I have to do is fine tune. Let's go to another one. Hey, let's say with this one, I want to bring my blacks down more. Well, I can do that just by adjusting the slider. So now I'm able to make this look more like a nighttime image, and maybe I want to bring out the vibrance a little more. Right, so it's really easy to tweak these and get them just the way you want them, but without a lot of work. Here, I would like to bring back a little more of the detail on that sand, so that's pretty easy. Raise the exposure a little bit, increase the shadows, and I've got more detail. Let's say I want to now increase the saturation on the sky. So that'll be in those purple areas and magenta. So very, very simple to go through these, and most of my editing is done. All I'm doing, again, is just tweaking from one image to the next. And that is a lot simpler than having to go and recreate the wheel every single time. So you say, oh, well, maybe this only works on landscapes and inanimate objects. Well, let's take a picture that's a portrait. This looks pretty good. And you'll notice that there's no undoing it, right? If you look at my history, it says it was imported with the preset applied. The only way I can get rid of it to show you the difference is if I click Reset over here. And Reset is going to default back to 0 and go back to my out of camera. So for my taste, this is a little flat and lifeless. Just applying the preset adds a whole lot more liveliness to it. I can pull back, let's say if I don't want that much highlight contrast, I can pull back on the whites a little bit. Right, so pulling back on the whites is gonna reduce that contrast. In the highlights, gives us a little softer look. So very easy to pull things back without affecting everything. Likewise, let's say that I find the saturation of that wood is a little too much. I can go in, drop my orange saturation, maybe push it less orange and more yellow, okay? And we have, again, very quickly, I've tweaked this image with what some might consider really major changes, very simply just with a couple clicks. And we can keep going through our images, and the same is going to be true pretty much for everything. Some, like this, may not require any change whatsoever. Maybe just a small tweak to the white balance. You know, where I bring in just a little bit more yellow and magenta into this to bring out those colors. And that's it. Maybe I want to bring a version that has a little more richness to it, that's a little heavier, not quite that heavy. Or maybe something like that. Bring in my shadows. And if I want to make it look more lively in terms of sunlight, I can just add more white and bring the highlights in to even it out. So it's pretty contrasty, but it can work for this situation. And it really does work for most photos taken with this camera. And I think that's my point. So if you have something that was purposely shot, like this one, this was actually purposely underexposed to protect the highlight information in this photo. I'll let it load up here. And if I zoom in, you can see that there's plenty of detail in the siding, in those windows, even in the lighthouse itself. Because of the Leica S-Type 007 has 15.5 stops of dynamic range, so I'm actually able to pull all that detail out of the file once I've shot it, but most of that detail is actually in the shadow area. So people don't always believe me when I tell them this is what I call single shot HDR, and it really is. So editing even a complicated shot for post image like this is pretty simple. And this is all to that point of working smarter, not working harder. Or like I like to simplify, work flow, not work slow. So you can clearly see that as I go through, I'm able to evaluate a large number of images quickly. And instead of editing ones after the fact, let's say I go through and make my selects, I wouldn't know that an image that was dark like that would be a candidate to actually work on. So I work on all my files, and as I'm going through them, that's when I make my selections. So I haven't done any kind of localized adjustments, which really is very powerful in Lightroom. But you can see that they look pretty good right here. If I reset this, it's not bad. But when we compare it versus the preset version, and I'll just flip back and forth here, there's just tons more detail and more life. It feels like it's being lit by the sun. And people ask me, oh, well, what did it look like out of camera? I said, well, I don't really know. I know it looked good when I brought it into Lightroom. And for me, that's my starting point. I want to know that I've got a good starting point to deal with. And this is just that. All right, so now let's talk about another reason why you might want to use presets. And in this case, it's for creative effect. And I'll show you just super quick here. And I told you I'd show you some of these over here. I think this would make for a pretty nice black and white. So Lightroom has built-in black and white presets. Some of them are nice and some of them are not quite as nice. Let's try this landscape preset. And you notice it changed my settings, right? This black and white landscape preset overwrote a lot of my changes. So not things like sharpening or lens profile, but it definitely, one, converted it to black and white, but also it overwrote my whites and my blacks. And this is pretty strong highlight contrast. It's because of the black and white mix here. And I can reevaluate the black and white mix. I'm just selecting auto for this particular one. And you can see we can change any of our values. This one might be a little tricky because that sky is so blue. So let's go back. I'm gonna pick a different one that has a little more tonal variation. So let's go to about this one right here. So we've got clouds in the sky. We've got our lighthouse. It's the end of the day. You can see the shadows are long. The light is very warm. And let's try, that's the default black and white landscape. We've got high contrast, punch, low contrast, which looks not great, flat, which looks really bad, soft, which also looks really bad, infrared, doesn't really look like infrared, and then we've got some sepia. So I think out of these, the built-in ones at least, the landscape one looks the nicest. But there's nothing to say that we can't make our own. So I'm gonna go back to here, back to our color version, and I am going to click black and white. Now that's just a straight up black and white conversion. It kept all of my settings the same. And I'm going to go in and now change our black and white mix to taste. And you can see when we apply our sliders, it's going to have a different effect. So I'd like to have a little bit darker skies. This is bringing the aqua and the blue down, is like putting on an orange filter. and raising up the reds and orange and yellow. Again, it's like putting on a red filter, so it increases the apparent contrast. And that looks pretty good. Let's take our highlights down a little more. Let me take the overall down a smidge. Leave our shadows there, but bring our blacks down. So this looks pretty good as far as black and white rendering. We'll increase our clarity a little bit. If we go too far, that's not going to be good, but it does add a little bit of punch to the black and white look. And that looks pretty nice. So what I'm going to do is create a new preset, and we'll just call it high contrast black and white. And we do have the option to do an auto black and white mix, but I'm going to leave that alone. And we're going to create. Now I can apply that. It'll overwrite to every image, but this is going to overwrite all of our settings. And that may or may not be what we want, right? So let's say that I'm going to try that again. So maybe we don't actually want the preset to apply, for instance, our lens corrections, or our calibration, or our sharpening settings, right? Because also treatment and profile. So, well, treatment is black and white, but all of these things are camera specific, and I don't necessarily want to overwrite that. So let's update that. And now when we apply this, it's going to be much more universal, and I can use this on other models of cameras. But it's not bad. So if you wanted to, you could import a whole series of photos and use your high contrast black and white preset. So I'll take this one, and I'm going to create just a convert to black and white and toning preset. Click black and white. I'm going to leave all of this alone. We're just going to go to the black and white mix and apply some of my contrasty settings here. All right. And we're going to go back up to split toning. And a little secret that I've discovered is if you want to tone something sepia, don't do it in the highlights. Only affect the shadows. Let's go to a gentle sepia tone here, bring back my saturation. So let's create that as a preset. And we'll call it sepia toning. We're going to uncheck everything. Change the treatment, which is black and white. We'll set the black and white mix and the split toning. I'm going to leave everything else. Everything else is untouched. And watch the difference now. So if we go to one of our color images, and I just say sepia toning, all of our regular preset information is untouched. And you might find that this works better for a majority of the photos rather than the more aggressive way. So taking a look here, if I roll this back to our color version, apply my sepia tone, so it's more in line with the original character of the shot. So this works pretty well. Let's say that I now want to create this, or I decided I want to make this more, call it vintage, with a little bit of a vignette, because I forgot the vignette. So I'm going to add my vignette in. I'm going to add some film grain. And we'll go ahead and we're gonna right click. I'm gonna update with current settings, but I'm only gonna choose the post-crop vignetting and grain, in addition to the others that I already have. So now let's go here. And also you'll notice that this doesn't actually change that contrasty look that much. If I go back to my original, here's my color version, apply my sepia tone with my little vignette, and it works pretty well. Let's see how it works with a person. Not bad at all. So these are easy ways that you can achieve a certain look without a lot of work, right? Lazy. Do the work once, apply it many times. All right, last I'm just gonna show you, if you wanted to import presets, this is where you go. So instead of creating a preset, you just go to import. And here we can simply look either on our desktop, if you've downloaded them into your downloads, and it's very easy to take presets from someone else and import them into your own Lightroom. Just as simple as clicking and saying import. And they'll show up right away, just like if you created your own. Thanks for watching. I hope you got something out of the video, learned about presets in Lightroom, and how you can incorporate them into your workflow. If you liked the video, please give us a thumbs up. If you want to see more videos like this, be sure to subscribe to the channel. And as always, go to red.forum.com for the latest Leica news, reviews, show reports, technical articles, and more. Until then, I'll see you in the next video.